The morning sun glinted off the sleek private jets lined up at Van Nuys Airport. Captain Thomas Reynolds checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. 6:30 a.m. He was early as usual. His mother had drilled punctuality into him since childhood, and 15 years of commercial flying had only reinforced the habit. Today marked his first day as a private pilot for celebrity clients, and Thomas wasn't taking any chances. He'd ironed his uniform twice, polished his shoes until they shone like mirrors, and arrived a full hour before his scheduled briefing. "First day jitters?" asked Roberta, the ground crew supervisor who'd been showing him around. Her weathered face crinkled into a smile. Thomas nodded, adjusting his pilot's cap. "That obvious, huh? Only to someone who's seen hundreds of new pilots come through." She patted his shoulder. "You'll do fine. Just remember, private clients are different from commercial passengers. Some want to chat, others want total silence. Your job is to figure out which type you've got and act accordingly." Thomas appreciated the advice but couldn't shake his nerves. After years of flying commercial routes between LA and New York, he'd finally made the jump to private aviation. Better pay, more interesting destinations, and no more dealing with hundreds of cranky passengers. But the trade-off was catering to the whims of the ultra-wealthy and famous, people whose names appeared in headlines and whose tantrums could end careers. "So who am I flying today?" he asked, flipping through the paperwork. Roberta raised an eyebrow. "You haven't been told? Just got the assignment code last night. Haven't had time to look up the client details." She leaned in slightly. "Calvin Broadus." Thomas stared blankly. "Snoop Dogg," she clarified with a chuckle. "You know, the rapper?" "Oh." Thomas felt his face flush. He wasn't exactly up on popular music. His playlist consisted mostly of classic rock and whatever his teenage daughter programmed into his phone. "Right, of course," Roberta laughed. "Don't worry. He's actually one of the good ones. Professional, usually on time. Just be yourself, follow protocol, and you'll be fine." Thomas nodded, but internally he was panicking. A famous rapper? On his first day? What if he said something stupid? What if he didn't recognize the man's entourage members? What if there was some special protocol for celebrity clients that he hadn't been briefed on? "I should probably review the security procedures," he muttered, mostly to himself. "Knock yourself out," Roberta said, already walking away. "But like I said, you'll be fine." Thomas spent the next hour meticulously going through every checklist twice. He inspected the Gulfstream G650, familiarizing himself with its layout and systems. He reviewed the flight plan to Miami, checked weather reports, and studied the passenger manifest. The document listed Calvin Broadus and up to 8 additional passengers, though their names weren't specified. Probably his entourage, Thomas murmured, thinking of the music videos he'd glimpsed over the years. Rappers always seemed to travel with dozens of people, bodyguards, friends, assistants. By the time he finished his preparations, the rest of the flight crew had arrived. The co-pilot, a laid-back guy named Pete with sun-bleached hair that suggested he spent his off-days surfing, greeted Thomas with a casual salute. "Ready for the VIP treatment?" Pete asked, slinging his bag into the cockpit. "As ready as I'll ever be," Thomas replied, straightening his tie for the 10th time that morning. 2 flight attendants boarded next, a cheerful woman named Liz and a tall man called Andre. Both had worked with celebrity clients before and seemed completely unfazed by today's passenger. "Just don't ask for an autograph," Andre advised as they prepared the cabin. That's the #1 rookie mistake. Thomas hadn't even considered asking for an autograph, but now he made a mental note to definitely not do that. As 9 o'clock approached, the scheduled boarding time, Thomas positioned himself near the aircraft stairs. Protocol dictated that he greet the primary client, and he was determined to make a good first impression. 9 o'clock came and went. Then 9:15. Then 9:30. "Is this normal?" Thomas asked Pete, who was lounging in the cockpit doorway. Pete shrugged. "For celebs? Yeah, pretty much. Their time isn't like regular people time." By 10 o'clock, Thomas was getting antsy. They were burning fuel, keeping the auxiliary power unit running, and their takeoff slot would need to be rescheduled. Just as he was about to call operations for an update, his phone buzzed with a message. "Primary arriving solo. Eta 5 minutes solo?" That was unexpected. Thomas relayed the information to the crew, who seemed surprised but not alarmed. "Must have sent his people ahead on a commercial flight," Liz suggested. 5 minutes later, Thomas spotted a figure approaching across the tarmac. The man was tall and slender, dressed in a blue tracksuit with a hood pulled low over his face. Dark sunglasses covered his eyes despite the overcast morning. He carried a single duffel bag slung over one shoulder and walked with a distinctive loose-limbed gait. Thomas straightened his posture and prepared his welcome speech. But as the man drew closer, doubt crept in. This couldn't be right. Where was the security? The assistants? The man wasn't even being escorted by airport personnel. And how had he gotten onto the tarmac without proper clearance? Security at Van Nuys was tight, especially around the private jets of the rich and famous. No one just wandered up to an aircraft without credentials. Thomas thought of the stories he'd heard about obsessed fans, about people trying to sneak onto celebrities' planes. His first day suddenly felt like a test. The man was now just 20 feet away, moving directly toward the aircraft stairs. Thomas made a split-second decision and stepped forward, blocking the way. "Excuse me, sir," he said in his most authoritative voice. "This is a private aircraft. I'll need to see your credentials." The man stopped, his expression hidden behind the sunglasses. He tilted his head slightly, as if confused by the request. "It's cool, man," he said in a surprisingly mellow voice. "I'm just running a little late." He tried to step around Thomas, who moved to block him again. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't let you board without proper identification. This aircraft is reserved for Mr. Calvin Broadus and his party." The man paused. Then slowly he lowered his sunglasses just enough to peer over them. His eyes held a mixture of surprise and amusement. "Dog, I am Calvin," he said. Thomas faltered for just a moment. The man did look somewhat like the photos he'd hastily Googled earlier. But something about the situation felt off. No security, no entourage, no advance notice of a solo arrival. Every instinct from his years of following aviation security protocols was screaming caution. "I'll need to see some identification." "Sir?" Thomas insisted, standing his ground. The man sighed and reached slowly into his pocket. Thomas tensed until he produced what looked like a wallet. He flipped it open to reveal a California driver's license. Thomas examined it closely. The name did indeed read Calvin Cortazar Broadus Jr., and the photo matched the man standing before him, albeit with a different hairstyle. But Thomas had heard about elaborate fakes, about determined fans who went to extraordinary lengths. "I'll need to verify this," Thomas said, pulling out his phone. "If you could just wait here a moment." "For real?" The man, possibly Snoop Dogg himself, seemed more bemused than angry. "This my plane, man. I'm already running late for this thing in Miami." Thomas hesitated. If this really was Snoop Dogg, he was making a terrible first impression. But if it wasn't, and he allowed an unauthorized person to board, he could be fired on the spot, or worse, create a serious security incident. Across the tarmac, Thomas noticed two security officers watching the interaction with interest. One touched his radio, presumably reporting the situation. "Look," said the man claiming to be Calvin Broadus, "call my manager if you need to, but I gotta get to Miami like yesterday." Just then Pete emerged from the aircraft. "Everything okay out here?" he asked, looking between Thomas and the visitor. "This gentleman claims to be Mr. Broadus," Thomas explained, "but he's arrived alone without security clearance, and I'm just following protocol to verify." Pete's eyes widened. "Oh shit," he muttered, then quickly composed himself. "I mean, Mr. Dogg, sir, we weren't expecting you to arrive unaccompanied. Please come aboard. We're ready for takeoff as soon as you're settled." The man nodded at Pete, then turned back to Thomas with a raised eyebrow. Thomas felt his stomach drop. Had he just tried to prevent Snoop Dogg from boarding his own private jet? On his first day? Before he could stammer out an apology, the airport security officers approached. One of them, a stocky man with a buzz cut, addressed the group. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his hand resting casually near his radio. "No problem," said the man in the tracksuit. "Just a little misunderstanding with my new pilot." The security officer looked more closely at him, then broke into a grin. "Well, I'll be damned. Good morning, Mr. Broadus. Didn't recognize you at first." Thomas wanted the tarmac to open up and swallow him whole. There was no longer any doubt. He had indeed just tried to prevent one of the world's most famous rappers from boarding his own private jet. "Sir, I am so sorry," Thomas began, mortification washing over him in waves. "I was just following security protocols," and Snoop raised a hand, cutting him off. A slow smile spread across his face. "Nah, you good. Better safe than sorry, right? I respect a man who does his job." Thomas blinked in surprise. He'd expected anger, demands to be fired, perhaps even a scene. Instead, the rapper seemed genuinely amused by the whole situation. "First day?" Snoop asked. Thomas nodded miserably. "Thought so." Snoop chuckled. "Well, now that we got that cleared up, we still going to Miami today or what?" The tension on the tarmac was thick enough to cut with a knife. Thomas stood his ground at the bottom of the aircraft stairs, still not entirely convinced that the man before him was actually Snoop Dogg. Sure, he had ID that said Calvin Broadus, but something about the whole situation felt off to Thomas. In his 15 years of flying, he'd never had a VIP client show up alone, without handlers or security. "Look, I understand protocol and all that," Snoop said, his voice remaining remarkably calm despite the situation, "but we burning daylight here. I got people waiting on me in Miami." Thomas glanced at Pete, who was making frantic let-him-on gestures from the doorway of the plane. The security officers were still hovering nearby, clearly unsure whether they should intervene. "Perhaps we could call your manager to confirm," Thomas suggested, trying to sound reasonable rather than accusatory. Something flickered across Snoop's face, a brief flash of irritation quickly replaced by resignation. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and held it to his ear. "Yo, Dave," he said after a moment. "Yeah, I'm at the plane, but we got a situation." He paused, listening. "Nah, nothing like that. New pilot doesn't believe I'm me." Another pause. "Yeah, for real." He chuckled and handed the phone to Thomas. "My manager wants to talk to you." Thomas took the phone hesitantly. "Hello, this is Captain Reynolds. What's going on?" demanded a sharp voice on the other end. "Why isn't Calvin on the plane yet?" "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm just following security protocols," Thomas explained. "Mr. Broadus arrived unaccompanied without prior notification, and I need to verify—" "That's Snoop Dogg," the voice cut in. "Calvin Broadus, the owner of the jet you're standing in front of. Check your manifest. I understand that's what he's claiming, but, oh, for the love of—" The manager's voice rose in frustration. "Put one of the security officers on the phone." Thomas reluctantly handed the phone to the stocky officer with the buzz cut, who listened for a moment, then said, "Yes, sir." "No, sir, I understand. Yes, that's him. No doubt about it." He handed the phone back to Snoop with an apologetic look at Thomas. "Dave's calling the owner," Snoop said, pocketing his phone. "Should be here in 5. By now, a small crowd had begun to gather at a distance. Ground crew members, pilots from other aircraft, and a few passengers who had recognized the famous rapper were watching the standoff with undisguised interest. Thomas noticed someone holding up a phone, clearly recording the scene. "Great," he muttered. "This'll be all over the internet by lunchtime." "Probably," Snoop agreed with surprising good humor. "Wouldn't be the first time I got caught in a mix-up." Thomas was finding it increasingly difficult to maintain his suspicion. The man certainly talked like Snoop Dogg, with that laid-back drawl and unbothered attitude the rapper was famous for. And now both airport security and his co-pilot had confirmed his identity. Was Thomas being overly cautious or just plain stupid? A sleek black SUV pulled up to the edge of the tarmac, and a man in an expensive-looking suit jumped out, practically running toward them. As he got closer, Thomas recognized Richard Wilson, the CEO of the charter company that had hired him. His heart sank. This was definitely not how he'd wanted to meet his new boss. "Calvin," Wilson called out, hurrying over to shake Snoop's hand. "I'm so sorry about this misunderstanding." "No big thing," Snoop replied easily. "Your man here was just doing his job." Wilson turned to Thomas, his expression a careful blend of professional concern and barely concealed irritation. "Captain Reynolds, I see you've met Mr. Broadus." Thomas felt his face grow hot. "Yes, sir. I was just following the security protocols we discussed during orientation. Mr. Broadus arrived alone without his credentials being called in advance, and I thought—" "I understand," Wilson cut in. "Security is paramount, of course. But in this case—" He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "In this case, I'm actually who I say I am," Snoop finished for him, a hint of amusement in his voice. More people had gathered now. Thomas spotted 2 women with professional cameras, paparazzi who somehow always knew when celebrities were around. They were snapping photos rapidly, capturing the awkward scene for posterity. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation on board," Wilson suggested, eyeing the growing crowd. "Been trying to get on board for 20 minutes, Snoop pointed out. Wilson shot Thomas a look that clearly said, "Fix this now." and Thomas stepped aside, finally allowing Snoop access to the stairs. As they all climbed into the aircraft, Thomas could hear the murmurs from the crowd. His first day was turning into a complete disaster. Not only had he delayed a VIP client, but he'd also created a scene that would likely go viral. So much for making a good impression. Inside the plane, the flight attendants were visibly startled to see the CEO boarding alongside their passenger. "Everything okay, Mr. Wilson?" Liz asked, looking concerned. "Just a small misunderstanding," Wilson replied smoothly. "Nothing to worry about." Thomas followed them into the main cabin, where Snoop had already made himself comfortable in one of the plush leather seats. Wilson sat across from him while Thomas hovered awkwardly, unsure if he should join them or retreat to the cockpit. "Captain Reynolds," Wilson said, gesturing to an empty seat. "Please join us for a moment." Thomas sat down stiffly, preparing himself for what would surely be a humiliating dressing down, followed by his immediate termination. "I want to apologize again for the confusion," Wilson began, addressing Snoop. "Captain Reynolds is new to our team, transferred from commercial aviation where security protocols are quite rigid." "No need to explain," Snoop said, removing his sunglasses and hooking them on the front of his tracksuit. Without the glasses, his face was even more recognizable, his eyes shrewd and observant. "Like I said, man was doing his job. Better safe than sorry." "That's very understanding of you," Wilson said, looking relieved. He turned to Thomas. "Captain, in the future, we do have a verification system for our VIP clients even when they arrive unexpectedly. A simple call to dispatch would have cleared this up immediately." Thomas nodded, too embarrassed to speak. Of course there was a system. He should have called it in rather than creating a standoff on the tarmac. "That said," Wilson continued, "your commitment to security is commendable. Many pilots might have been starstruck and neglected proper procedure entirely. Wouldn't want just anybody walking onto my plane," Snoop added, "especially looking like I do today." He gestured to his casual attire. "Coming straight from a community event. Didn't have time to change." Thomas finally found his voice. "I truly apologize for the delay, Mr. Broadus. It won't happen again." "Call me Snoop," the rapper replied. "And for real, we good. No harm done." Wilson stood up, apparently satisfied that the situation had been resolved without damage to the company's relationship with an important client. "Well, I'll leave you to your flight. Captain Reynolds is one of our best pilots despite this rocky start. You're in good hands." As Wilson headed toward the exit, his phone rang. He answered it, listened for a moment, then turned back with a grimace. "Calvin, I'm afraid there's already a video on Twitter. Snoop Locked is trending." Snoop laughed, a genuine belly laugh that seemed to release whatever remaining tension hung in the air. "Course it is. Internet don't miss nothing these days." After Wilson departed, Thomas should have gone straight to the cockpit to prepare for takeoff. Instead, he lingered, feeling there was more to be said. "I really am sorry," he began again. "Man, stop apologizing," Snoop said, waving him off. "Trust me, I've dealt with way worse than a pilot who takes his job seriously. Still, it wasn't the welcome you deserved." "Look at it this way," Snoop said, leaning forward. "You the only pilot I ever met who wasn't trying to take selfies or get me to listen to their cousin's mixtape." "That's refreshing." Despite everything, Thomas found himself smiling. "I wouldn't know what a mixtape was if it hit me in the face, Mr. Dog. I mean Snoop. See? That's what I'm talking about." Snoop grinned. "Now we gonna sit here talking all day or we gonna get to Miami?" "Miami it is," Thomas replied, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. Maybe he hadn't ruined everything after all. As he headed to the cockpit, Thomas could hear his phone buzzing with notifications in his pocket. No doubt the video was spreading and friends and family were recognizing him. His daughter would probably die of embarrassment when she saw it. Pete was already in his seat, running through the pre-flight checklist. He gave Thomas a sidelong glance as he sat down. "So," Pete said, "that happened?" "Yep," Thomas replied, putting on his headset. "That happened, and we're not fired?" "Apparently not." Pete shook his head in disbelief. "Man, if I'd pulled that stunt, I'd be cleaning out my locker right now." "Guess I got lucky," Thomas said, beginning his own checklist routine. "He was pretty cool about the whole thing." "That's Snoop," Pete said with a shrug. "Heard he's one of the chillest celebrities in the business." As they prepared for takeoff, Thomas couldn't help but wonder what the rest of this flight would bring. His first day had already been more eventful than his entire career in commercial aviation, and somewhere in the back of his mind a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be the disaster he'd initially thought. Maybe it would make for a pretty good story someday. Little did he know, this was just the beginning. The Gulfstream G650 climbed smoothly through the clouds, leaving Los Angeles behind. Thomas focused intently on the controls, trying to make this the smoothest flight of his career. If he couldn't undo his disastrous first impression, he could at least demonstrate his skills as a pilot. Pete kept shooting him sidelong glances from the co-pilot's seat. "Would you stop that?" Thomas finally said. "Stop what?" "Looking at me like I'm about to spontaneously combust." Pete grinned. "Just wondering what it feels like to become internet famous in real time," Thomas groaned. During their pre-flight checks, he'd gotten a glimpse of his phone. Hundreds of notifications, text messages from friends. His daughter had sent 16 messages in a row, mostly consisting of shocked emojis and "Dad, what did you do?" "I don't want to talk about it," Thomas muttered. "Too late for that," Pete said, nodding toward his own phone, which was propped on the console displaying a muted news feed. Thomas could see his own face frozen in an expression of stern authority next to a headline, "New pilot locks Snoop Dogg out of his own jet." "Perfect," Thomas sighed. "Just perfect." The cockpit phone rang, startling them both. Thomas picked it up. "Captain Reynolds, it's Liz. Our passenger would like to speak with you when you have a moment." Thomas felt a fresh wave of dread. Maybe Snoop had changed his mind about being understanding. Maybe now that they were safely in the air, he was going to demand Thomas be fired after all. "Tell him I'll be right there," Thomas replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I can handle things here," Pete assured him. "We're at cruising altitude, clear skies all the way to Miami." Thomas nodded gratefully and made his way back to the main cabin. He found Snoop lounging comfortably, scrolling through his phone with an amused expression. The rapper looked up as Thomas approached. "Check this out," Snoop said, turning his phone screen toward Thomas. Thomas reluctantly looked at what appeared to be a social media feed. The video of their confrontation had indeed gone viral, with millions of views already. But what surprised him were the comments. "Team pilot all the way. Man was just doing his job." Respect to Snoop for being cool about it. This pilot deserves a raise for actually caring about security. "People are taking your side," Thomas said, bewildered. "People appreciate authenticity," Snoop replied with a shrug. "You weren't trying to flex or make a scene. You were just doing your job." He gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit down, man. You look like you about to pass out." Thomas sat, still trying to process this unexpected turn of events. "My publicist called," Snoop continued, scrolling through more reactions. "Says this is gold. Wants us to do a follow-up interview together when we land." "An interview?" Thomas repeated, horrified at the thought. "I don't think my employer would." "Already cleared it with Wilson," Snoop cut in. "He thinks it's great publicity for the charter company." Of course he did, Thomas thought. Wilson would see the marketing potential immediately. "Our pilots are so dedicated to security, they'll even stop Snoop Dogg if his paperwork isn't in order." "I don't know the first thing about being interviewed," Thomas admitted. "Nothing to it," Snoop assured him. "Just be yourself. That's what got you here, right?" The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. Being himself, stubbornly sticking to protocol despite all evidence that he was making a mistake, had indeed gotten him here. Trending on social media and being offered media appearances with one of the world's most famous musicians. "Why are you being so cool about this?" Thomas asked suddenly. "I basically accused you of trying to steal your own plane." Snoop leaned back, considering the question. "You know how many people I meet who just tell me what they think I want to hear? Who act all fake around me because of who I am?" He shook his head. "It's refreshing to meet someone who doesn't give a damn about my fame, who just treats me like anybody else." Thomas hadn't thought of it that way. "I still feel terrible about the whole thing." "Don't," Snoop said firmly. "We all just doing our best with the information we got at the time. You thought some random dude was trying to board a private jet. I respect that you stood your ground." He grinned. "Plus, this the most entertainment I've had in weeks." As they continued talking, Thomas found himself relaxing. Despite his initial impression, Snoop was thoughtful and surprisingly easy to talk to. They discussed everything from aviation to family life, finding unexpected common ground as fathers trying to relate to their kids. "My daughter's probably dying right now," Thomas said, glancing at his silent phone. She's 16. I'm already embarrassing by default. This is going to put her over the edge. Nah, man, Snoop laughed. This probably the first time she's thought her dad was cool. Trust me on that. Meanwhile, back in Los Angeles, the story was spreading like wildfire. Local news stations had picked it up, with anchors trying to keep straight faces as they reported on the misunderstanding at Van Nuys Airport. Aviation blogs were debating the merits of Thomas's strict adherence to protocol. Twitter had moved on from Nair Snoop Lock to Nair Pilot and the D, with memes multiplying by the minute. At Wilson Charter Services, the phones were ringing off the hook. Reporters wanted statements. Potential clients wanted to know if all their pilots were as security conscious as Thomas Reynolds. The company's social media manager, who had been about to leave for lunch when the story broke, was now hunched over her keyboard, crafting an official response that walked the delicate line between supporting their employee and apologizing for the inconvenience to a valued client. In the air, blissfully unaware of just how big the story was becoming, Thomas was having the most surreal experience of his life. He was teaching Snoop Dogg how to read some of the flight instruments. So this tells you your altitude, he explained, pointing to one of the displays he'd pulled up on his tablet. And we at 41,000 feet right now? Snoop asked, genuinely interested. That's right. Cruising altitude for transcontinental flights. Cool, Snoop nodded. Always wondered how all this works. He gestured vaguely at the cockpit door. You ever let people come up and see the cockpit? After 9/11, the rules got a lot stricter, Thomas explained. On commercial flights, absolutely not. But on private jets like this, it's at the captain's discretion. So that's a yes, Snoop asked with a hopeful expression that made him look younger than his years. Thomas couldn't help but smile. That's a yes. Once we're closer to Miami and if conditions remain good, I'll give you the tour. As promised, when they were about an hour out from Miami, Thomas escorted Snoop to the cockpit. Pete did a double take, clearly still not used to the idea of having a celebrity on board, much less in the cockpit. Mr. Dogg, sir, Pete stammered. Welcome to the flight deck. Just Snoop is cool, the rapper replied easily, looking around with undisguised curiosity. This is dope. Like a spaceship up in here. Thomas gave him a basic overview of the controls, explaining the yoke, the various displays, and the communication systems. Snoop listened attentively, asking surprisingly insightful questions. So you could fly this thing with just instruments if you had to? Like if you couldn't see nothing outside? That's right, Thomas confirmed. It's called instrument flying. We're trained for situations with zero visibility. That's wild, Snoop said, clearly impressed. Y'all don't get enough credit for what you do. The sincerity in his voice touched Thomas. He'd been flying for 15 years and most passengers barely acknowledged his existence, beyond a cursory thank you when deplaning. As they approached Miami International, air traffic control cleared them for landing. Thomas returned to his seat, leaving Snoop to watch from just behind the cockpit door as they descended through scattered clouds toward the Florida coastline. Miami Tower. This is Wilson Charter Flight 420, on final approach, Thomas said into his headset, using their designated flight number. Wilson Charter 420, you are cleared to land on runway 9, came the response. Then after a brief pause, is it true you have Snoop Dogg on board? Thomas glanced at Pete, who raised his eyebrows in surprise. It was highly unusual for air traffic controllers to ask about passengers. Tower, that's affirmative, Thomas replied cautiously. Right on, said the controller, his professional tone slipping for just a moment. You're all over the news up here. Welcome to Miami. As they taxied toward the private aviation terminal, Thomas could see a small crowd gathered behind the security barriers. Some were holding cameras with long lenses. Paparazzi, Pete muttered. Word must have gotten out about our arrival. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. Great, more publicity. It's about to get a whole lot worse, Pete said, pointing to a news van pulling up. Or better, depending on how you look at it. After they came to a stop and completed the shutdown procedures, Thomas took a deep breath before leaving the cockpit. Liz and Andre were already preparing the exit door while Snoop gathered his duffel bag. Looks like we've got a welcoming committee, Thomas said, nodding toward the windows. My publicist works fast, Snoop replied with a grin. You ready for this? Not even a little bit. Just stay close to me, Snoop advised. I'll handle the talking if you want. As the door opened and the stairs were lowered, camera flashes erupted from the small crowd. Thomas squinted against the bright Miami sun, momentarily frozen in the doorway. This was so far outside his comfort zone that he couldn't even process it. Then he felt a hand on his shoulder. Snoop had come up beside him. "Showtime," the rapper said with a wink. And together they descended the stairs into the waiting media frenzy. The Miami heat hit Thomas like a wall as he stepped off the plane. Camera flashes popped in his face, momentarily blinding him. He'd never been the focus of media attention before, and his instinct was to retreat back into the aircraft. But Snoop's hand remained firmly on his shoulder, guiding him forward. "Just smile and keep walking," Snoop advised under his breath. "We'll stop at the edge of the tarmac for a few questions." Thomas nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. He spotted at least 3 TV news crews among the crowd of reporters and photographers. How had this become such a big story so quickly? When they reached the designated spot, microphones thrust toward them from all directions. Thomas froze, but Snoop stepped forward with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. "What's good, everybody?" Snoop greeted the press with a relaxed smile. "Y'all really showed up quick. Must be a slow news day." That got a laugh from the reporters, easing some of the tension. A woman in a crisp blazer pushed to the front. "Snoop, can you tell us what happened back in LA? Is it true this pilot wouldn't let you board your own plane?" Snoop chuckled. "That's right. Captain Reynolds here was just doing his job, making sure nobody unauthorized got on board. Even me." He turned to Thomas. "Want to tell your side?" All eyes shifted to Thomas, who felt his throat go dry. He was a pilot, not a public speaker, but something about Snoop's supportive presence gave him courage. "I was following security protocol," Thomas said, his voice steadier than he expected. "Mr. Broaddus arrived alone without advance notice, and I needed to verify his identity before allowing him to board. In the aviation industry, security is our top priority." "Were you angry when you realized who he was?" another reporter called out. "More embarrassed than anything," Thomas admitted with a small smile. "It's not every day you try to stop a celebrity from boarding their own jet." "And I wasn't even mad," Snoop added. "How could I be?" "Man was protecting my plane. That's what I pay him for." The exchange continued for about 10 minutes, with Snoop fielding most of the questions and occasionally drawing Thomas into the conversation. To Thomas's surprise, the reporters seemed more amused than critical, treating the whole thing as a light-hearted human interest story rather than a security incident. When Snoop's publicist finally called an end to the impromptu press conference, Thomas felt a wave of relief. They were escorted to a waiting SUV with tinted windows, leaving the clamoring press behind. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" Snoop asked as they settled into the back seat. "Speak for yourself," Thomas replied, loosening his tie. "I feel like I just went through a firing squad." "You did good, man." "Natural on camera." Snoop pulled out his phone. "This thing is blowing up even more now." "We trending #1, Thomas groaned. "Please don't tell me that. Why are you so stressed about it?" "This is good publicity. People loving the story." "Because this isn't my world," Thomas explained. "I'm just a pilot. I like routine, predictability. Suddenly I'm trending on social media and giving press conferences. It's a lot." Snoop studied him for a moment. "I feel you. Fame ain't for everybody." He paused. "Tell you what. After my event tonight, I'll have the PR team issue a statement asking for privacy for you. Say you just want to get back to doing your job without cameras in your face." The thoughtfulness of the offer surprised Thomas. "You'd do that?" "Course," Snoop said with a shrug. "You did me a solid by flying me here despite our rough start. I can do you a solid back." As they drove through Miami, Thomas stared out the window, processing the surreal turn his day had taken. 24 hours ago, he'd been just another pilot starting a new job. Now he was in a car with Snoop Dogg discussing how to handle his sudden fame. "What exactly is this event you're here for?" Thomas asked, realizing he didn't actually know the purpose of their flight. "Youth center opening," Snoop replied. "Been working with the community here to create a space for kids to make music, learn about the industry without getting caught up in street stuff." "That's not what I expected," Thomas admitted. Snoop raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" Thomas hesitated. "I don't know. A concert? A party?" "I do that too," Snoop laughed. "But this the real work. Kids need options, opportunities. Music saved my life back in the day. Trying to pay that forward." Thomas nodded, feeling a new respect for his passenger. There was clearly more to Snoop Dogg than his public persona suggested. The SUV pulled up to a modern building in a neighborhood that had seen better days. A crowd of people waited outside, mostly teenagers and young adults. When they spotted the vehicle, they erupted in cheers. "Looks like your fans are waiting," Thomas observed. "Our fans," Snoop corrected him with a grin. "After that press conference, you got your own following now. Come on in, see what we built here." "Oh, I don't think," Thomas began. But Snoop was already getting out of the car, waving for him to follow. Reluctantly, Thomas stepped out into another round of cheers and camera flashes. This time, though, it was mostly smartphone cameras wielded by excited teenagers rather than professional photographers. Somehow that felt less intimidating. Snoop moved through the crowd with ease, shaking hands and posing for quick selfies. Thomas hung back, trying to blend into the background, but it didn't work. People recognized him from the viral video and wanted pictures with Snoop's pilot, too. Inside the building, Thomas was impressed by what he saw. Recording studios with professional equipment. Classrooms for music theory and business education. A performance space with a small stage. Everything was new and state-of-the-art. "You funded all this?" Thomas asked as Snoop gave him the tour. "Me and some friends in the industry," Snoop confirmed. "Plus corporate sponsors, local businesses. Community effort." They reached a room filled with about 20 teenagers sitting in a circle of chairs. When Snoop walked in, they fell silent, eyes wide with excitement. "What's good, young world?" Snoop greeted them. "Got a special guest with me today. This is Captain Reynolds, the pilot I was telling y'all about on the phone earlier." Thomas gave an awkward wave, surprised that Snoop had already mentioned him to these kids. "Captain here has an interesting story about sticking to your principles even when it's hard," Snoop continued. "Thought y'all might want to hear it from the man himself." Before Thomas could protest, Snoop had guided him to an empty chair in the circle. The teenagers looked at him expectantly. Thomas cleared his throat, wondering what on earth he could say to these kids that would be of any value. I'm not sure what Mr. Dogg told you," he began hesitantly. "He said you wouldn't let him on his own plane because you didn't recognize him," one boy called out. "That you weren't scared even though he's famous." Thomas smiled despite himself. "Well, that's more or less what happened. I was just doing my job, following the security protocols I was trained to follow." "Were you scared you'd get fired?" a girl in the back asked. Terrified, Thomas admitted. "It was my first day on the job. I thought for sure I'd messed up my whole career. But I still couldn't let him board without proper verification. That's the thing about principles. They only matter when they're inconvenient to follow." For the next hour, Thomas found himself engaged in a surprisingly deep conversation with the teenagers. They asked questions about his career, about decision-making under pressure, about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. Snoop occasionally chimed in, but mostly he let Thomas take the lead, watching with what looked like approval. By the time they left the youth center, the sun was setting over Miami. Thomas felt different somehow, lighter, as if the anxiety of the day had been replaced by something else. Purpose, maybe, or perspective. "Those kids were really something," he said as they got back into the SUV. "They're the future," Snoop agreed. "Just need people to believe in them, show them different paths." "Thank you for including me in that," Thomas said sincerely. It wasn't what I expected from this day." "Sometimes the unexpected turns out better than the plan," Snoop replied with a knowing smile. "Speaking of which, you got dinner plans tonight?" "My crew's having a little gathering at the hotel. Nothing crazy, just food and conversation." "You should join us," Thomas thought about it. His original plan had been to eat alone in his hotel room, call his family, and try to process the bizarre events of the day. But something told him that continuing this unexpected journey with Snoop might be more valuable. "Sure," he said finally. "I'd like that." "Cool," Snoop nodded, looking pleased. "Oh, and heads up. There might be a few industry people there who saw our story and want to talk to you about some ideas." "Ideas?" Thomas asked suspiciously. "What kind of ideas?" Snoop grinned mysteriously. "Let's just say some good might come out of our little misunderstanding. More than just a viral video." As the SUV carried them through the Miami evening, Thomas wondered what he was getting himself into. His safe, predictable life as a pilot seemed to be veering wildly off course. Yet for the first time in years, he felt a spark of excitement about the unknown path ahead. Whatever Snoop had in mind, Thomas suspected it would be just as unexpected as everything else about this extraordinary day. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing after all. 6 months had passed since that fateful day at Van Nuys Airport. Thomas sat in his living room, still finding it surreal to see himself on television. The late-night talk show host was introducing him and Snoop as the internet's favorite unlikely friendship. "Dad, they're about to show the clip again," his daughter Holly called from the kitchen. "Want me to record it?" "I think we have enough recordings," Thomas replied with a chuckle. There's probably not a person left on the planet who hasn't seen it by now. The past half-year had transformed Thomas's life in ways he never could have imagined. After their impromptu press conference in Miami, where Snoop had praised Thomas's professionalism and joked about finally finding someone who didn't recognize him, the story had exploded beyond social media into mainstream news. They'd appeared on morning shows, podcasts, and even a commercial for an airline security system where Thomas played himself, sternly blocking people from boarding planes. Wilson Charter Services had promoted Thomas to their VIP division, putting him in charge of training new pilots in both flight operations and client relations. His stern adherence to protocol, once considered maybe a bit too rigid, was now the company's selling point. "Safe enough to stop Snoop" had become their unofficial slogan. But the most unexpected development had been his ongoing friendship with Calvin Broadus himself. What started as a PR moment had evolved into genuine mutual respect. Thomas had flown Snoop to concerts, business meetings, and family events across the country. In return, Snoop had invited Thomas and his family to studio sessions and backstage at shows, much to Holly's everlasting delight. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text message. "Speaking of the man himself, you watching? They about to show your mean mug face again, lol." Thomas smiled and typed back, "Unfortunately, yes. Holly insists on watching every time it airs." 3 dots appeared immediately, followed by, "Tell Lil Lady I said what's up. You ready for tomorrow?" Tomorrow? Thomas felt a flutter of nerves at the thought. Tomorrow would be the biggest flight of his career, a cross-country journey with not just Snoop, but a plane full of music industry VIPs heading to a charity concert. As a pilot who had spent most of his career flying strangers from point A to point B, the idea of being responsible for transporting a plane full of celebrities still made him anxious. All set. "Flight plan filed, crew briefed," he texted back. Cool. Don't forget your game face." "Might need to lock some fools out," Thomas laughed out loud. Snoop never tired of joking about their first meeting. On the television, the talk show host was now interviewing them about their latest project, a scholarship fund they'd established for underprivileged kids interested in aviation. It had been Snoop's idea, born during one of their conversations about Thomas's path to becoming a pilot. "Not enough brothers and sisters in the cockpit," Snoop had said. "Let's change that." The Reynolds Broadus Scholarship Fund had already provided flight training for 15 students, with plans to expand the program nationwide. Watching the clip of himself explaining the initiative to the talk show audience, Thomas barely recognized himself. 6 months ago, he'd been terrified of cameras. Now he was discussing philanthropy on national television like he'd been doing it his whole life. The doorbell rang, pulling Thomas from his thoughts. "I'll get it," Holly called, racing to the door with the energy only a teenager could muster at 9 p.m. on a weeknight. Thomas heard muffled voices, then his daughter's excited squeal. "Dad, you have visitors." Before Thomas could get up from the couch, Snoop Dogg strolled into his living room, followed by his wife Shantae and Thomas's own wife Lisa, returning from a spa day that had been Shantae's treat. "Surprise house call," Snoop announced, making himself comfortable in an armchair. Shantae wanted to drop off something for tomorrow. Thomas's wife Lisa kissed him on the cheek. "You should see what they've done," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Shantae pulled out her phone and showed Thomas photos of the aircraft they'd be taking tomorrow. The standard corporate jet had been customized with a special livery, a cartoon depiction of Thomas in his pilot's uniform, standing with arms crossed in front of a cartoon Snoop. "You didn't?" Thomas groaned, though he couldn't help smiling. "Oh, but I did," Snoop replied, clearly pleased with himself. "The no-fly without ID tour jet. People gonna be taking pictures of this plane everywhere we land." Holly peered over Thomas's shoulder at the photo. "That's actually pretty cool, Dad." "Traitor," Thomas muttered, but he was laughing now. "I'm never going to live this down, am I? Not in this lifetime." Snoop confirmed cheerfully. As their family settled in for an impromptu evening together, Holly showing Shantae her college applications, Lisa discussing the charity concert with Snoop, Thomas found himself reflecting on the strange path that had brought them all here. One moment of stubborn adherence to protocol had changed everything. If he'd just let Snoop on the plane without question that day, he'd still be flying routine charter flights, anonymous and unremarkable. Instead, he'd become part of something bigger, not just a viral moment, but a genuine friendship that had led to real impact through their scholarship program. The next morning, Thomas arrived at the airport before dawn, as was his habit. The customized jet sat on the tarmac, its new livery even more outrageous in person than in the photos. Ground crew members were taking selfies with it, and Thomas could already see a small crowd of aviation enthusiasts gathered at the fence line with cameras. Inside the terminal, the VIP lounge was beginning to fill with Snoop's guests for the charity tour, musicians, actors, and social media personalities. Thomas recognized most of them from television or Holly's patient explanations of who's who in current pop culture. "Captain Reynolds," called a voice from across the room. Thomas turned to see Richard Wilson approaching with a group of people in business attire. "These gentlemen are from United Airlines. They've heard about our security protocols and wanted to meet the man himself." Thomas suppressed a sigh. This too had become routine, being trotted out as the strict pilot for potential clients and partners. He shook hands politely as Wilson extolled his virtues, painting the incident with Snoop as if it had been company policy rather than a near disaster saved only by Snoop's good humor. "Actually," one of the executives said, "we're more interested in your scholarship program. Our diversity recruitment has been struggling, and what you and Mr. Broaddus have created seems to be making real inroads." Thomas straightened, his interest genuinely piqued. "We're always looking for industry partners," he said. "The biggest barrier for many of our students is the cost of flight hours. Perhaps we could discuss potential internship opportunities," the executive suggested. Before Thomas could respond, there was a commotion at the entrance to the lounge. Snoop had arrived, surrounded by his actual entourage this time, security, assistants, and his ever-present manager, Dave. Unlike the casual hoodie-wearing figure from 6 months ago, today Snoop was dressed for the cameras in a custom suit with aviation-themed pins on the lapel. The room's energy immediately shifted as people gravitated toward the celebrity. Thomas used the distraction to excuse himself from Wilson and the airline executives. He needed to complete his pre-flight checks, not network with potential sponsors. As he made his way toward the exit, Snoop spotted him and broke away from his group. "There he is," Snoop called out. "The only pilot who ever told me no." People laughed. Phones came out to capture the interaction, but Thomas just smiled and kept walking. Snoop fell into step beside him. "For real, though," Snoop said, his voice dropping so only Thomas could hear. "You good with all this? The plane, the publicity, all these people?" The question caught Thomas off guard. In 6 months of interviews and appearances, Snoop had never asked if he was comfortable with the attention. He'd just assumed Thomas was along for the ride. "I'm getting used to it," Thomas admitted. "Still prefer the cockpit to the cameras, though." Snoop nodded. "I feel you. After this tour, we can dial it back if you want. Focus on the scholarship, less on the story." Thomas considered this as they walked out onto the tarmac, the morning sun glinting off the customized jet with their cartoonish faces. "Actually," he said, "I was thinking we could expand the scholarship. Maybe partner with some of the commercial airlines, create a direct pipeline for students to get hired after training." Snoop grinned. "Look at you, man. 6 months ago, you were just trying to follow the rule book. Now you planning to change the whole industry?" Thomas laughed. "I'm still following the rule book. Just writing some new chapters." As they approached the aircraft, Thomas paused to run his hand along the fuselage. His daughter had been right, it was pretty cool in a completely ridiculous way. A permanent reminder of how one small moment could change the course of a life. "You know," Snoop said thoughtfully, "most people would have milked this fame thing differently. Tried to get their own reality show or something, but you just want to help kids become pilots." "It's what I know," Thomas replied simply. "That's why this worked out," Snoop said, gesturing between them. "You never tried to be something you're not. Not with me, not with the cameras, not with any of it." He extended his hand. "Respect." Thomas shook it firmly. "Likewise." As they boarded the aircraft, No ID check necessary this time. Thomas felt a sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with viral fame or celebrity connections. 6 months ago, he'd been so worried about making a good impression that he'd almost lost his job. Now he understood that doing the right thing, even imperfectly, was what mattered. In the cockpit, Thomas settled into his seat and began his pre-flight routine. The familiar checklist, a comforting rhythm in the midst of the day's chaos. Whatever came next, more scholarships, more media, more unlikely friendships, he would face it the same way he faced that first confrontation on the tarmac, by being precisely who he was. No more and no less. And that, he reflected as he prepared to welcome his celebrity passengers, was the most unexpected lesson of all.